Welcome to Philbits, where we explore specific themes, ideas, and arguments in the history of philosophy. These episodes are brought to you by philosophy2u.com. My name is Dr. Todd Mei, and in this episode, we'll be exploring the question, what is existentialism? This primer is designed to introduce you to what I think are the most important distinctions and ideas about that 20th century movement in philosophy that offers so much in the way of understanding what human existence is all about. So let's get started. Existentialism is a fascinating and curious specimen within the history of philosophy. It's a philosophy that's concerned about the big question of the meaning of existence. But as we will see, none of the existentialists accept that there is one single meaning with a capital M to existence. What also complicates the study of existentialism is that the philosophers we're going to be looking at today, none of them called themselves an existentialist, with the exception of Sartre, who once used the term existentialism to refer to his own philosophy. But as we'll see, he has other things in mind when thinking about what existence is all about. Here's an outline of the 5 points that we'll be looking at in terms of existentialism. Who's existentialism? The guiding thought for existentialism. The historical sources of existentialism in Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And the final 2 points will look at existentialism in terms of 2 distinctions. One, where existentialism considers the self as the source of meaning, and the other as the source of meaning as being other than the self. There are many philosophers that group with existentialism, but for the purpose of this primer, we'll be looking at 4 thinkers. On the one hand, Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, and on the other, Karl Jaspers and Gabriel Marcel. The reason for this distinction and carving up of the existentialists is that Sartre and Camus articulate a very distinct notion of existentialism, where the source of meaning comes directly from the self. On the other hand, Marcel and Jaspers articulate a different kind of existentialism, where the meaning for existence comes from a source outside of the self. Just a moment ago, I said that existentialism was concerned with the meaning of human existence. And that claim makes it sound as if philosophies prior to the 20th century weren't really concerned with meaning and existence. And that's not true. If you look at ancient Greek philosophy like Plato and Aristotle, the meaning of existence lies in how we can live virtuously. Early modern philosophy like Descartes, Kant, and Hegel, that is concerned with how we live and how we flourish, but there are other concerns and questions that come just prior to that. And one of the emphases of early modern philosophy is that we have to understand how reality is constructed and what reality is. When we get to the 20th century with existentialism, they're coming in the wake of those kinds of philosophies. And what we get is a kind of reaction to the ancient Greek ideas and also to the early modern philosophy concerned with what reality is like, what truth is like. And the existentialists make a bold claim out of a reactive dissatisfaction. They think a lot of the philosophy that comes prior to them simply just started asking the wrong questions and/or asked the wrong questions and got the wrong answers. And so they think that a lot of the language we use to talk about reality and to talk about what a good life is just gets it wrong. So the existentialists we're looking at will try to find a way to discover and diagnose what is wrong about our understanding about human existence and try to offer something distinctly new. The difficulty with existentialism is that because it's trying to discover something new, it often uses different terms, or if you're a bit critical of existentialism, you'll say they create their own jargon. But what each philosopher is attempting to do is find something that we have taken for granted or entirely missed, give a new term to it so that we can think about our lives in a different way. In order to get a better idea of how we misunderstand the nature of human existence, let's look at 2 historical precursors to existentialism. And I think these 2 historical precursors are decisive for getting a grasp about what's going on with existentialism. The first, chronologically speaking, is Søren Kierkegaard, a 19th century Danish philosopher who's famous for his book, Fear and Trembling. And in that book, he gives a very distinct notion of what faith is. And it's not very clear what he thinks about faith, and there's a lot of scholarly debate about what's going on in that book. But for our purposes, what's important to understand is Kierkegaard thinks that human existence, or existence as such, is basically unfathomable for human beings. And because of that, It puts pressure on the ways in which we make decisions when we do things. Because we can't necessarily understand entirely what's going on, we can't necessarily understand what the best thing to do is. So we reach these moments in our lives where these critical decisions just don't have simple answers. Kierkegaard wants to claim that we think we have those answers to hand. We have different systems and techniques of interpretation. One of the ways in which we use systems is a system of ethics, where values of good and bad provide guides or guidance for action in terms of what we want to do. We should help another person because we all agree that value is a good value. Now, Kierkegaard is suspicious of these kinds of values because he thinks that they conceal what's going on in existence. It may seem quite easy to understand that help for another person is a good value, but there might be something that we're missing. Because we can't understand what's going on in existence, we might want to make a decision based upon some kind of value or notion that gives us purpose or gives us hope. So we might believe that if we do something according to value X, that it's good in the eyes of the community, and there might be a reward in some way in terms of praise from the community. Or if we believe in supernatural systems, we might believe that if we act according to a certain value system or ethical system, we will be not necessarily rewarded in the present life, but rewarded somehow spiritually in the afterlife. And of course, a lot of religions have something to do with this way of thinking. But Kierkegaard, even though he was a Christian, had a very different notion of what being spiritual and religious was about. And this quote has to do with the kind of faith we put in our decision. So Kierkegaard is saying that genuine faith is not believing in some kind of reward for our action. It's actually something entirely different. And he writes, if a young girl, in spite of all difficulties, is still convinced that her wish will be fulfilled, this conviction is not at all that of faith. She is convinced in all her childlike naivete and innocence. Her conviction is lovely, but one thing that cannot be learned from her is how to make movements, for her conviction dares not look impossibility in the eye in the pain of resignation. There's a lot going on in that quote, especially in terms of Kierkegaard's own special terminology related to making movements and resignation. But what we can see for our purposes is that Kierkegaard rejects this naive or childish notion of faith in which we think we'll just simply be rewarded for the action if we commit to the action. Instead, what's going on is that we're brought to this sort of metaphorical precipice of decision making, and we may have one or two choices that we want to make. There may be more. And Kierkegaard wants to say that we just don't know what the outcome is, and that when we commit to a decision, when we make this leap into genuine faith, we're making that based upon not the idea of being rewarded, but embracing something about this life, the imminence of this life. And that in itself is a kind of reward. It's not the reward in the sense that the child might think, but it is a reward in terms of existential commitment. We embrace that decision and we move forward with it. The famous passage from Nietzsche that you've probably come across at some point, God is dead, the holiest and the mightiest thing the world has ever possessed, has bled to death under our knives. And this phrase, this passage is often referred to as the transvaluation of values, and I'll get to that in a moment. But what we see here is that Nietzsche is expressing a certain or specific kind of atheism. When he says God is dead, he wants to reject God as the moral authority. In other words, he's making the claim that the way in which we understand our existence through religion and the values, the ethical values and the moral values that religion gives to us, that needs to be excavated or erased. And once we have done that, we've left a void which can be filled creatively. We have to figure out what values we want to adopt in order to make the most of our lives. Now, several years later, he writes a book called The Genealogy of Morals. And in that, he gives a little bit more detail as to why our notions of what's good and what's bad, or what's good and evil, aren't quite up to scratch. And he traces this genealogy back to the kind of language and vocabulary of the aristocracy, that the aristocracy is the class that's in power, has certain values that they want to perpetuate that make them look good and make the rest of the people, or the majority of the people, not look good, and in fact feel a bit sheepish and under the power of the aristocracy. So that language becomes a kind of way in which things are kept in check by the aristocracy. We believe in the same values of the aristocracy, yet we're not quite the aristocracy. So Nietzsche wants to get rid of all that kind of way of thinking, that whole system those moral and ethical values, and trying to discover what kinds of values that we ought to live our life by. Now, I won't go into detail about that because that will just take us down the road of trying to understand what values Nietzsche wants us to adopt. But there's another interesting moment in Nietzsche, and that's the notion of resentment. So let's have a look at that passage. Nietzsche writes, "The beginning of the slave's revolt in morality occurs when ressentiment itself turns creative and gives birth to values. Ressentiment of those beings who, denied the proper responsive action, compensate for it only with imaginary revenge, whereas all noble morality grows out of a triumphant yes to itself. Slave morality says no on principle to everything that is outside, other, non-self, and this no is its creative deed. The reversal of the evaluating glance, this essential orientation to the outside instead of back onto itself, is a feature of ressentiment. In order to come about, slave morality first has to have an opposing external world. It needs, psychologically speaking, external stimuli in order to act at all. Its action is basically a reaction." So if we are all slaves or we're not aristocratic, then the only way we can break out of this is this kind of ressentiment, or what's often translated into English as resentment. That is the beginning of breaking the bond. So we are all slaves, we're not the aristocracy. So the slave revolt begins as a reaction to say no, to reject those things that are often given over to us and sold to us as being noble. So that reaction creates the empty space or the void that I talked about, in which we can find which kind of values affirm our own lives. Just to give a bit of a recap for the historical sources, for Kierkegaard, existence is mysterious and unfathomable. Meaningfulness, in particular embracing life, arises by heeding this mystery. In contrast, for Nietzsche, existence has been hindered by pre-existing values of religion and the ruling classes. Meaningfulness arises by rejecting these values and finding our own. Looking first at the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre, we get an idea of why he thinks humans are self-creating, why meaning comes from within the self, as it were, that we have our own resources to generate or come up with what will be authentic or sincere meanings and values. On radical freedom to self-create, Sartre writes, "Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself." That is the first principle of existentialism. We are condemned to be free and can rely on nothing to determine who we are. Condemned because man did not create himself, yet is nevertheless at liberty. And from the moment that he is thrown into this world, he is responsible for everything he does. Now, those passages come from a 1945 public lecture, which is now in print as Existentialism and Humanism. But we get a flavor of Sartre's notion about human existence and nature. Basically, he wants to reject what's often referred to as the techne argument for human existence. Techne is the Greek term for making. And what he's rejecting is this idea that something, in particular, some other supernatural being, actually fashioned or made or produced humans. And if we think in that way, which he thinks is how most religions think about the nature of human existence, if we reject the techne argument, we reject this notion that we're in debt to some other source other than ourselves. Instead, he adopts this notion from a German philosopher called Martin Heidegger, who's often associated with existentialism, but we're not talking about him in this video. Heidegger talks about this notion of abandonment, that we are thrown into existence, that we arrive in existence and we find that there's a lot of things going on around us that we have no power over. We don't control being born, we don't control the time period that we're born into, the family, the place, etc., etc. So we are, as it were, abandoned into existence with no tie except to the given context in which we arise. There is nothing that makes us in that respect, or at least nothing that makes us to which we owe meaning and value. So Sartre rejects the techne argument, and because of that, because of this existential abandonment, this context and situation we find ourselves in, for Sartre means that we therefore must create ourselves. There's nothing prior on which we are indebted to in order to draw on that creation. Now, just to note, Heidegger doesn't believe in this same kind of radical self-creation, but that's a different story. I just want to draw the distinction between Heidegger and Sartre, because Sartre does borrow quite a bit from Heidegger in terms of this existential abandonment and thrownness into existence. Now let's look at something about how a passage where Sartre expresses something a bit more specific about freedom. In Sartre's main work called Being and Nothingness, he writes about freedom: "The one who realizes in anguish his condition as being thrown into a responsibility which extends to his very abandonment has no longer either remorse or regret or excuse. He is no longer anything but a freedom which perfectly reveals itself, and whose being resides in this very revelation. But as we pointed out at the beginning of this work, most of the time we flee anguish in bad faith. We are free when the final term by which we make known to ourselves what we are is an end." I've highlighted the term anguish because it goes back to what I mentioned in the earlier part of this video, that existential thinkers believe that we've gotten a lot of things wrong about the meaning of existence. And in this case, when things go poorly with respect to the values we believe in, we might get a sense of anguish. We might be uncomfortable with what's going on. We might be dissatisfied. That's sort of the beginning of a kind of anguish that Sartre is talking about. Another kind of anguish is that when we realize that we want to move beyond these values that we're dissatisfied with, we're torn. We see that we can move on, but we might step back because we're afraid what that might open up, what might happen as a result, what we might become for rejecting these kinds of values. But for Sartre, that is the moment of realizing how radically free we are. So that anguish has two sides to it. One, it's a fear about rejecting all that's familiar. And two, it's a fear about opening ourselves up to what possibly can be in terms of our existence, what can be more in terms of our existence. And once we realize that, Sartre wants to argue that that is a basic component or structure of human existence. That's the way human existence is. And he talks about human existence in terms of the basic feature of our consciousness is negation, that we always notice what's lacking. And there can be good and bad forms of that, or what he often terms in relation to the pairing sincere and bad faith. So if we really understand what's lacking sincerely, then we go out and we seek to fill that lack, as it were. If we notice that there's something lacking, but we shy away from it for whatever reason, we don't want to commit, that is noticing the lack in a bad way, and that ends up in bad faith. We just don't react, we just don't act according to how we ought to fill that particular lack. Now, because this radical freedom is a basic structure or feature of human existence, Sartre then makes the claim, which puts a huge responsibility on us, that there is no alibi or excuse for us for fleeing from this radical freedom. And if we do, that means we are living our existence in bad faith. An example I like to give to my students is the lecture hall. So if students are at a lecture at 9 o'clock in the morning, they often would rather be asleep or somewhere else. And so according to Sartre, what that means is if you notice this certain lack in your life where you'd rather be somewhere else other than the lecture, then you have the freedom, you have no alibi to avoid this, you have the freedom to choose. And if you really live authentically, you're going to choose that which you really desire or want. If you decide, on the other hand, to remain in the lecture, you're acting in bad faith. So it's very important for Sartre that you realize the certain lacks that arise in your life, and you decide authentically what end you want to pursue in order to fill those lacks or not. Albert Camus provides a very interesting contrast to Sartre. One of his most famous concepts is that of the absurd, and on that he writes, "In a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. His exile is without remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity." And later on, "The absurd is essentially divorce. It lies in neither of the elements compared. It is born of their confrontation." The interesting contrast between Sartre and Camus is that Camus really wants to focus on what for Sartre was anguish. And Camus does this by looking at that moment or those moments in which everything just seems to break down. And Camus has a lot of examples in his essay on philosophical suicide, which is a different term which we can't go into, unfortunately. But Camus wants to talk about those routines which we've taken for granted, we think are meaningful. So waking up at 6 o'clock in the morning, going for a run, getting into the car or taking the public transportation to work, pre-pandemic, obviously. But being in that rut, we just think that rut, that commitment to meaning, that career, going out and earning a wage, having hobbies when we're not at work, all this thing about doing things on the weekend, that will break down. There'll be something that opens up where we see in that opening that those kinds of commitments and actions and meanings and values really aren't carrying anything. So Camus wants to describe this in terms of a kind of absurd relation. Those meanings and values that we think exist don't exist. And the reason for this is because that the universe and the world, just there is no meaning to it. Meaning is not a quality or feature of the world or universe. It is silent. It's just a collection of objects and processes that go on. It's humans through their psychology, emotion, and cognitive capacities who like to attribute meaning to things. But once we find that that relationship doesn't exist and it's absurd, that's the divorce. So absurdity only arises as a relation. The relation is where the human commits to or projects meaning upon the universe. But like Sartre, once we realize that there is a moment of freedom in which we reject that kind of relation, then it opens up human existence. So to go back to what I talked about earlier in the video, for Camus, what we misunderstand about the nature of human existence is that it's meaningful. It's not meaningful. Now, Camus is not a pessimist. His philosophy is not cynical. It's not negative. It just doesn't want to end there. What we find with a lot of existentialism is that negative movement is there to evacuate or clear the space of reasoning so that we can fill it with something creative or positive. Camus has a particular problem. With Sartre, we saw that he could fill that void with moments of authentic self-creation where we identify the ends that are really sincere and for ourselves. With Camus, because he can't talk about meaning or meaningfulness, he struggles to find a way in which we can fill that void with any kind of positive content. So he talks about in the famous reflection on the myth of Sisyphus, who's condemned to roll a boulder for eternity up a hill. The boulder rolls back down and he has to do it again as punishment from the gods. He imagines Sisyphus as being happy because he fully embraces this punishment. That's sort of hard to stomach, doesn't seem very satisfying, or there's something not quite fully articulated about as to why Sisyphus can imagine himself happy. But later on in his novel called The Plague, which is a very interesting read, especially during this time of pandemic, of COVID-19, what occurs there is that the characters are quarantined and faced with a plague, which seems like it's never going to abate. It's kind of the absurd personified, as it were, in the disease that's infecting all the inhabitants of the Algerian port town of Oran. What the characters do is they come together through moments of solidarity. And so Camus wants to offer a kind of positive content through humanity coming together in solidarity in face of or despite the truth of the lack of meaning in existence. So just to recap a little, what we saw with both Sartre and Camus is this idea that we're rejecting the structures and systems of meaningfulness and meaning and values, and that creates a space for Sartre for self-creation and for Camus to find some kind of solidarity or some kind of positive content that we don't call meaning in living our human lives. So those kinds of existentialisms are the ones that find meaning within the resource of the self. We are there not only to reject the given systems and meanings that come before us, but we're also there under our own action and own agency to find positive content. Looking at Karl Jaspers and Gabriel Marcel, we're going to find just the opposite. Instead of the emphasis of radical freedom, we're going to find a kind of intellectual existential debt, or the onus to take heed of something else before we can engage in the act of discovering meaning. So let's look now at Karl Jaspers. Jaspers is famous for this term, the encompassing, and it's that which we cannot comprehend. And he writes in his book, Philosophy and Existence, through reflection, we ask about being itself, which always seems to recede from us, in the very manifestations of all the appearances we encounter. This being we call the encompassing, but the encompassing is not the horizon of our knowledge at any particular moment. Rather, it is the source from which all new horizons emerge, without itself ever being visible as a horizon. So here's a rather good example of what I talked about earlier in terms of the way in which existentialists will try and coin different terms to try and get at that which we've misunderstood or we simply taken for granted. So the encompassing, you think, what is the encompassing? What is this thing being itself? So a way to think about what Jaspers is talking about is the way we go about our existence, our lives, is that we identify with certain things and certain actions. They may be abstract, they may be concrete. If you're a big sporting fan, you might identify with a particular football team or sporting team, or you might be identifying abstractly with some kind of notion of the good life or a career as the key aspect of that good life. I want to be a doctor, I want to be an engineer, etc. I want to be a philosopher. So these are the kinds of things that are very specific, concrete, and singular. Now for Jaspers, all those instances are instances of this thing being itself, which the nature of being itself is that it encompasses all those individual singular things, those ideas and entities that we think about in our daily lives, that we think about in terms of how our life is going. Those are just instances of the encompassing nature of being, or the encompassing. And for Jaspers, the key point is we can never think about the encompassing itself. We can have the term the encompassing that refers us to this, it gestures towards the encompassing nature of being itself, but we know that just represents or signifies or indicates in some way. So although we can indicate the encompassing, we can never grasp it entirely. It's always outside our reach. Now, this creates a kind of debt of humility in the task of going about of our existence for Jaspers. We can't so boldly and arrogantly and so assuredly claim that we understand what existence is about, that these actions are good, etc., etc. Instead, it should reorient us in how we think about how we should go about our lives and how we relate to each other. So let's get some kind of indication from Jaspers about where this goes. A change in how we think. Jaspers writes, each mode of truth is characterized by him who speaks in it at any time. The mode of truth is given along with the encompassing. If we now try to go beyond these conflicts and seek for truth itself, we never find it by giving precedence to one mode of the encompassing as authentic truth. We alternately succumb to prejudices that absolutize one encompassing. So again, a lot of interesting things going on within that quote. One is Jaspers has a very specific notion of a theory of truth, as philosophers like to talk about it. So truth is an aspect that inheres within being itself, or the encompassing. And because we can never grasp the encompassing, we can never know truth itself, we can only know an aspect of it. So when we seize upon one mode of truth, then, or we give, as he says, we give precedence to it, that then becomes problematic, or potentially becomes problematic. We have to do so by virtue of going about our daily lives and of going about existence in terms of building things and trying to achieve things. But once we emphasize or give privilege or priority to that one mode or seizing of the encompassing, that's when we become blinded to other things. And if we're not humble or not aware about this kind of commitment we're making to one mode of the encompassing, then it can lead down the path of tragedy or disaster. And you can speak about these disasters in terms of racial violence, genocide, world wars, economic injustice. So these are all things that derive from a fundamental existential error about how we relate to existence or being itself. Another way of understanding what Jaspers is talking about is that in terms of human knowledge being fallible. So we have to commit to things, but we have to be very aware of the fact that even though we think we might be certain or convicted about something being true or right, that human knowledge is inherently fallible. So there's always going to be problems with the kinds of claims and assertions we make and the kinds of evidence we rely on. So there's always something that undermines any kind of sense of certainty that we might want to arrive at. So there is a philosophical humility about living our lives and living with others. In contrast to Jaspers, Gabriel Marcel is going to reflect the notion of humility in a very different way. So he's going to draw on this idea that existence or being itself is unfathomable. But for Marcel, the real key is that it's going to reorient the way we relate to others. So Marcel's very famous for this distinction he makes between a problem and a mystery. And he writes in his book On Being and Having, in fact, it seems very likely that there is this essential difference between a problem and a mystery. A problem is something which I meet, which I find complete before me, but which I can therefore lay siege to and reduce. But a mystery is something in which I am myself involved, and it can therefore only be thought of as a sphere where the distinction between what is in me and what is before me loses its meaning and its initial validity. Marcel is making this distinction between those things which fit within a problematic way of thinking, so means-end thinking, problem, solution, question, answer. Think about daily tasks where we identify an end or goal and we figure out the best way to meet that, to go from A to B, for example, and those things which fall outside that category. And those things which fall outside the category cannot be problematized. We can try to do it, but in doing that, we misrepresent the mystery. So there's this area to existence itself, like Jaspers' Encompassing, which we cannot fathom. It remains a mystery. Now, Marcel is not being negative about that. He finds that an ever prodding or provocative source of reflection for existence. So it can't be reduced, it can't be defined completely, so it's always there as a creative source. It's always there reacting or acting with us and opening things up for us. And so when we talk about this mystery in relation to other people, Marcel is going to move to make the claim that other people actually embody or instantiate this notion of the mystery of human existence, or what he calls elsewhere the ontological mystery, or the mystery of the nature of being itself. So let's look at the second passage. Availability to others, and the English term availability comes from the French disponibilité, and it's another term for which Marcel is famous. And he writes in Being and Having, "If I treat a thou as a he, I reduce the other to being only nature, an animated object which works in some ways and not in others. If, on the contrary, I treat the other as thou, I treat him and apprehend him qua freedom. I apprehend him qua freedom because he is also freedom and not only nature. The other, insofar as he is other, only exists for me insofar as I am open to him, insofar as he is a thou, but I am only open to him insofar as I cease to form a circle with myself, inside which I somehow place the other, or rather his idea. For inside this circle, the other becomes the idea of the other, and the idea of the other is no longer other qua other, but the other qua related to me." Some very interesting distinctions going on with Marcel's use of the term nature and the pairing he and thou. One of the things we get from this passage is that nature for Marcel is this sphere or environment of determined relations that simply rely perhaps on biology, cause and effect, action, reaction, whereas the notion and the idea of the person as the he or she fits within this kind of the human as a natural being, as a part of all these kinds of determined cause and effect relationships. Whereas the notion of thou speaks to, again, a very religious in connotation. It speaks to this notion of personhood. And the other is also this idea of the person or the personhood of the person that is not me. And so Marcel wants us to cease drawing this cognitively closed circle around us in which we simply identify other people as objects within my own plans or projects. And I'm saying that very deliberately because Marcel is a great critic of Sartre, who likes to think about other people in terms of projects for the authentic ends that I want to realize. And Marcel's against this. He thinks that people should be genuinely a part of our projects, not as objects, but as other people. So if I cease to draw this cognitively closed circle around myself, which might be formed by a very narrow notion of a project, and I open myself up to other people as persons, as thou, as Marcel says, then what happens is that circle metaphorically breaks, and I make myself available to the other person. And in doing so, I recognize the person not as an entity of nature, of cause and effect relations, as an object, but I recognize that person in their personhood as the same kind of free being as I myself am. And so there's this moment of a potential for mutual recognition within within Gabriel Marcel's notion of what it means to live an authentic human existence in relation to and in faith to the mysteriousness of being itself. So that's all the time we have in this primer for existentialism. I hope you've enjoyed it. Just to recap a little, we looked at the historical precursors to existentialism in Friedrich Nietzsche and Soren Kierkegaard, and we saw how from Nietzsche we get this kind of existentialism that rejects systems of meanings and values in order to arrive at this idea of freedom and a freedom from those systems and values, so that we have to either, in terms of Sartre, create an authentic end or meaning to our lives, and with Camus, we have to reject meaning and meaningfulness altogether, and we have to arrive at some other positive content or relation with others and with existence. In Kierkegaard, we wanted to pay heed to the mysteriousness of existence, and we saw that with Karl Jaspers, our ways of understanding who we are, how we are, can't really encompass what reality or being itself is, and so we have to have a certain humility about living our lives. And with Gabriel Marcel, we saw that humility manifest in terms of how we relate to others. We have to be open to other people, not as objects, but in terms of their personhood or as their thou. We have to break our cognitively closed circle of thinking and open ourselves or make ourselves available to the other person. Just one last comment before we break. I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk that existentialism is a very practical philosophy. If you want to hear more about that, please go to Philosophy to Use podcast side and see an interview with the former professional poker player, Sam Holden, where he talks about the influence of existentialism and how he decided to leave a very lucrative career as a professional poker player. If you've liked this video, please share and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm Dr. Todd Mei, and this has been Philbits, brought to you by philosophytoyou.com.